When you release stuck emotions from the body, your whole world shifts around you in extremely positive ways, although a few strange and weird things can happen in the process. Now, none of these things are harmful. In fact, they can be a positive sign of processing and release, but it helps if you know what some of them are, as it will be less expected if they happen, and you'll understand it's a normal part of the process. And by the way, these are much more likely to happen if you're actually engaging in safe and effective emotional release approaches, ones where you're processing on a deep somatic or body and consciousness level, not just standard talk therapies or surface level techniques. So the first is muscle shaking, twitching, or popping. I've started with this one because it was one of the most pronounced and noticeable for me. Back in my body's emotionally traumatized state, my body was so tense and tight, I didn't even realize how seized up and hard everything had become. When I really started going in on healing the trauma and releasing the stuck emotional energy, certain muscles would start twitching, vibrating, and sometimes jerking suddenly. This is a sign that the body is trying to release the tension and stuck energy, although it can seem a bit weird at first. However, I started noticing that the twitching and vibrating was occurring in the exact same places within my body that I was feeling the physical and emotional discomfort. And that when I just allowed it to happen and allowed myself to relax into it, eventually the vibrating muscle would suddenly pop, just like when a massage therapist pops a muscle knot. It was as if feeling the somatic sensations in the body, whilst knowing I'm safe as awareness, started heating up the corresponding muscles in that same area. Muscles that I realized were so solid and seized up. It was as if eventually they would start freeing up and literally vibrating until they suddenly softened and expanded. It felt like hard rocks in the body would start to twitch and shake until they suddenly popped into a vaporous gas and dissipated. When I first got to work on a particularly traumatized part, I actually had semi-violent jerks in my right shoulder. It was as if a bracing shock response, so deeply embedded into the right-hand side of my body, was now freeing itself up and playing out. And it took a while to settle down. For a while, I felt a little bit jumpy, but eventually, with deep allowing and knowing I'm safe, it went away, leaving the body much more profoundly relaxed. Another thing that can happen is that it appears to get worse before it gets better. This can happen when you're engaging in an emotional release session or in general on your healing journey. When you finally become deeply present to what you're feeling and rest as awareness, it's a bit like a space opens up within you. Feelings and emotions that may have been held down and suppressed for many years can finally rise up into that space, ready to be gently embraced in the loving awareness and released. In the short term, however, it can sometimes feel more intense. This is most often a sign that old emotional energy is coming to the surface more rapidly. The most important thing is to be rooted in your inner safety, so you know experientially that you can never be harmed even by intense emotional energy. It's wise to be patient and go step by step and not feel like you're overwhelmed. And if certain emotional states seem to be very repetitive or cyclical, it may be a sign that it's not truly processing and releasing yet. But it's also likely to be a normal part of the process. By bringing acceptance and unconditional love to even your most intense emotions, you begin their transmutation. Another thing that can happen is spontaneous deep breaths. I notice this happening in people spontaneously, especially when I ask them a deep question. Just like, what do you truly want in your heart of hearts? It's as if they then suddenly access a feeling, a place within them that hasn't been looked at deeply yet. and suddenly some emotional energy arises and releases. I first noticed this within myself when I really allowed my bodily sensations to intensify. I would start to feel one of the sensations particularly strong, and it was as if I would have to suddenly take a deep breath and sigh as the sensation expanded and softened. In fact, sighing and crying can be a sign of profound emotional release. Everyone knows that feeling of feeling a bit better after you've had a good cry, right? Our body sighs and cries as a way to release stuck emotional energy and arrive at acceptance and peace. In fact, at one point in my healing journey, I actually wanted to cry as much as possible, as strange as that is to say, because I realized how much better I felt afterwards. And so I opened myself up to it completely. Obviously, once again, if these types of states seem cyclical or like you're stuck in them, it's wise to look at what else you might need. But often, when you want relationship, career, or business success, and you're coming up against resistance, the temptation is to just muscle through and just try harder. Although you may discover, like I did, that this never seems to work. You may get some results, but then they backfire, fall flat on their face, or leave you completely feeling completely burnt out. You're still carrying around the tight emotional energy and trying to force when you really need to relax and flow. So sometimes you just need to let go and kind of cry your way to success. Sometimes I feel that's what I did, because it was after those moments of deep letting go and release, I suddenly became infused with this new energy and streams of ideas that finally started resonating with others. Another strange but common sign of release is spontaneous yawning, or feeling suddenly hot or cold, or tingles all over your body. These are signs that your nervous system is rebalancing and energy is moving. Another thing that can shift during this process has to do with your dreams. As emotional energy releases from the system, the dream space can become more vivid, symbolic, or even bizarre. Old memories or strange scenes might arise, not to be just analyzed like puzzles, but to be felt, as if the body-mind is finishing old stories and resolving and releasing subconscious impressions that were frozen in time. Sometimes you'll wake up with a sense that something subtle has cleared, or that a tension you couldn't quite name has appeared to soften. Sometimes you might wake up in the morning at the end of a dream still feeling the emotions of the dream state, leaving you feeling a little bit weird. Dream events and symbology may be deeply relevant, like messages, which the meaning of becomes spontaneously clearer with time. But it's important in these moments not to overanalyze too much and instead feel the traces of emotional energy to complete its processing. When deeply releasing, just like the body trembles, the dream field moves, an echo of the same unraveling. After deeply releasing stuck emotional energy, other weird and strange things can start happening. Well, weird and strange depending on your perspective of life and reality. You can suddenly experience a sudden uptick in synchronicities, serendipities, and intuitive flashes. This is because an old emotional program has dropped out and you're suddenly just being and flowing again. It's as if when strong emotions or background emotional energy is present within consciousness, it fuels this sense of being just a person, of being just an isolated entity cut off from the whole. But when this emotional energy is released, you relax deeper into simply being. You're no longer focused so much on the story of me. You're more so resting in the deeper inner stillness, where it's seen that everything is interconnected and non-separate at the deepest level. You see, when we are conceptualizing ourselves to be an isolated, limited entity, we tend to see evidence in the world for that belief. The magic of everything seems sucked out and everything seems real and about me. When we relax and rest as being, the boundaries between me and others and the world seem to become more porous. They always were an illusion to begin with. However, in resting as our true nature, effortless awareness, we start to actually notice these interconnected energies represented as corresponding forms between the apparent inner and outer world. You may think of someone and they call. You may imagine something and it appears in some form in the apparent external. Repeating numbers, signs, and symbols become more obvious, as if the greater universe that you are is whispering back to your individual human self, whispers of the magic and divinity in the most ordinary of experiences. Another thing that's almost guaranteed to happen, that's not so weird and strange, but can feel unfamiliar to the uninitiated, your body starts to feel much more relaxed. A beginning of a deep healing journey for me was when I started to experience physical pain throughout my body. At first, I thought it was a physical thing, like something was physically wrong with me. It was only after reaching out to a healer friend that they told me it was most likely emotional, and they turned out to be right. It took a while for it to soften and free up and release that bound up tightness, but the more I released, the less pain I would feel, and the more comfortable and spacious I would feel in the body. And that set off a whole chain of effects. Sometimes we don't even notice the background discomfort in our body because it feels like we've kind of been swimming in it for so long. And when the nervous system finally relaxes, it can feel quite peaceful or euphoric, or at least our body feels so much more comfortable and relaxed. This also frees up a lot of energy, right? Energy that was being used for holding our body and muscles up so tightly. So finally, we can approach those activities that before we were feeling too much emotion and resistance around. Finally, we can flow with our creative activities and manifest what we want. So another strange thing that can happen after a deep emotional release is that you start to feel like a different person. You may have thought that confidence, creativity, and verbal flow were skills that you had to cultivate, but after a deep release, you may find these qualities coming to you naturally. They were always there, just seemingly covered up by mental and emotional tension. It's as if the emotions are like programs that run certain aspects of your apparent personality. When these programs drop out, your natural state of relaxed confidence and ease starts to flow and express itself more and more. No longer are you thinking everything through to the 10th degree and overanalyzing. No longer are you planning and scripting everything in your head before it comes out your mouth. Now, you retain social awareness, it's just not overblown. Without the constant fear of bad consequences or backlash, you're free to flow in communication and create and express without limits. So if you feel called to explore awakening and deep emotional releasing, which I call embodiment, I have a free mini course called Awake and Embodied Essentials, and the link to that is in the video description. Alternatively, if you feel called to invite deep revelation and transformation into your life, I invite you to join Awake and Embodied. Over there, we have the full Awakening and Embodiment course, community platform, and weekly live group calls with me, all to support you on your journey. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you in the next one. Peace.